my innocence. I slept in this nursery. I stared out this window at the orchard. I woke up happy every morning. It looked exactly the same then. Nothing's changed. All white. Oh, my orchard. After the dark and dank autumn and cold, cold winter.
Yes, a cold, cold winter. Have you had enough of that yet? But we're here not to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about the winter or the weather. We're here to talk about genre. Though genre is like the weather. You always have it, right? It's not like you never have weather. You always have, or you ever not have weather. You always have some kind of weather. Even when there seems to be no weather, we say it's just calm. It's like that with genre as well. There's always a genre operating, right? To structure our expectations as we go about reading a text. We walk up to a poem, we say, that's a poem. And all of a sudden we're reading it in a certain way that we wouldn't read it if we said, that's a novel, right? And this is something that Fowler gets into in his difficult and abstract essay that I wanted you to have a stab at, take a stab at anyway. Fowler calls our attention to modern concepts of meaning, such as Dan Sperber and Deidre Wilson's theory of relevance. As Sperber and Wilson have made very clear, Fowler writes, coding and decoding, and that must include generic codes, play only a limited part in communication and interpretation, which are largely a matter of small-scale inferences guided by relevance. The principle of relevance, which is a rather abstract concept that he introduces, operates at every stage. In the case of literary interpretation, relevance must necessarily be to readers' own cognitive environments, even to their own interests. But, and this is an important but whether they know it or not, they're also continually guided by relevance to what they assume to be the writer's intention. Now, those writer's intentions include genre. Like, what is the writer intending to create here? Is it a poem? Is it a play, a drama? Is it an epic? Is it a narrative? Is it a novel? Is it a short story? And so on. He says parenthetically, these promise, after all, the pleasure of recognizing intended harmonies. And you do get this sense of satisfaction. I suppose it's a form of pleasure that you get when you look at a poem and you recognize perhaps the rhyme scheme, and you realize this is a poem. It's a poem that has a rhyme scheme, one of these recognizable rhyme schemes, like a sonnet. We're going to be talking about sonnets. Generic organization, Fowler continues, may be conjectured to facilitate interpretative inferences at almost every level of structure. And we're going to see some examples of, at a very small level of structure, the individual tiny little micro episode, we see genre operating in such a way as to provide some guidance for us, right? As we go about attempting to apprehend or comprehend the play. The point here is that, to try to pierce through the abstraction a bit, the point here for Fowler's making, and not just Fowler, is that we read a work, as we read a work, our individual interests tend to take a backseat at some point to the interest, so to speak, of the genre of that work, the genre that we decide was intended by the author. Our own individual interests matter little often when we try to make sense of the elements of the work. Genre matters more. The genre that we decide that the writer intends. If we think we're reading a poem, we see an image of a small pig in the poem, okay? We're going to think of other small pigs, or maybe large pigs large and small, that we've encountered in other poetic works, right? We're also going to think about the suitability of pigs to, shall we say, the sonnet form and the sonnet content. Do pigs tend to be celebrated in sonnets? I think the answer to that typically would be no, right? What we're not going to do is allow our own personal interest in pigs to, this is as we get better as readers, we're not going to allow our personal feelings about pigs, personal attitudes and knowledge of pigs, attitudes towards and knowledge of pigs, to distract us from what we see as the generic game going on, right? And that's why I say, and it's a continuation, of course, of what Fowler is saying and Sperber and Wilson are saying, so much depends upon genre, does it not? Indeed, as Anise S. Barwashi and Mary Jo Reef argue, and this is taken from the actual discussion question that, frankly, I wish more people had gone after. I think a lot of people stuck with trifles this week, which is fine. That was obviously allowed. Barwashi and Reef argue, Genres structure our perceptions of literary actions, representations, and identifications, and they do so, quote, at almost every level of structure. And here again, there's this insistence that even on a very micro level, you feel the force of genre. Okay, we're gonna see this play out here in a moment. If you walk up to a play with the idea of a comedy or farce in mind, you'll see comedic elements, even if you don't see comedy writ large, right? Which would be a good test case for this claim. And here we're going to get into something that you guys are saying. Brenton is saying. Brenton is arguing, quote, the subtitle of The Cherry Orchard is A Comedy in 4 Acts. So, to Bawarshi and Reeves' point, Brenton continues, this sets the stage. This generic designation sets the stage for how we should perceive actions throughout the play. I thought that was very well said. Certain actions will be seen as comedic. They could have been seen as farcical, perhaps. Of course, farce is a subgenre, have another go with that word, of comedy. Tragedy is a competing genre, right? Certain actions will be seen as comedic. They could have been seen perhaps as farcical, perhaps even as tragic. And we're going to see here in this example chosen by Brenton, this sort of choice between the tragic significance of a small event and a more farcical or comedic one. Here's Brenton speaking about Epikhodov, who has the following lines and directions in the final act. Quote, the aged fierce, in my conclusive opinion, isn't worth mending. This is Epikhodov. His forefathers had better have him. I only envy him. Puts a trunk, here's the stage direction, puts a trunk on the hat box and squashes it. This seems to exemplify, Brenton argues, both the glossary of terms, definition of farce as, quote, broad verbal humor and physical bustle and horseplay, and the Norton's definition of farce as, quote, slapstick or other physical humor. But, Brenton continues, read without the context of comedy, specifically farce, and without the stage direction, in other words, if you don't feel the force of comedy as a genre, you don't feel that you're reading a genre, and you're not sort of obedient, as it were, to this generic designation, this generic kind of compulsion almost, which is, as Brenton has already said, was instituted by the subtitle of the play. This line could be seen, right, as serious and malevolent, since it deals with whether the older fierce is worth helping. Go back to it, the aged fierce, in my conclusive opinion, says Epikhodov, isn't worth mending. So it'd just be left on the stage at the end of the play, and nobody will care, right? The line is juxtaposed with the practical gag, though, of the hat box being squashed, which softens the delivery, right? So it can be seen as a very serious kind of statement that it would be proper to a tragic assessment of someone's fall, so to speak. You could say that fierce falls at the end of the play. But then you have to think about that hat box, which makes us feel that, no, we're really reading a comedy. Brenton continues, perhaps this draws a connection between Epikhodov's reckless speech regarding a human being and his reckless actions towards the luggage, which I thought was a nice afterthought that he had. Another example, let's get into another example of this same sort of moment, right, in which it's a tiny moment. That's what I think makes it especially interesting, right? It's a very small little micro moment in which genre, okay, seems to be exerting its force, right, one way or the other, and compelling us to read the play one way or the other in this moment. Or maybe if we are not sure which genre the play is obedient to, which we are in such moments, right, looking for direction, okay? In either case, genre seems to be the most important element, as opposed to some kind of errant thought we might have about what's going on. Even thinking about the theme itself, the question of whether human beings, for example, are ever not worth mending. Is that Chekhov's theme, right? This sort of hopelessness about human nature, right? Something along those lines maybe is interrupted as we try to solve the more basic and fundamental problem of genre. So here's that other example. And this is one in which violence is done to the human body rather than a hat box. How different may various wielding of Fierce's slapstick in Act 3 and her own parasol at the end of Act 4 appear if we were told that we were reading a peculiarly Russian sort of tragedy, as opposed to what we are told we're reading, a comedy in 4 acts. The Russian tragedy, one in which no character dies, that would be the peculiarity of it, because in tragedy, typically somebody dies. Often, as you know, if you've read Shakespeare tragedy, many people die. Maybe Fierce does die at the end of the play, but you can imagine that you might feel that you're reading oh, this is how the Russians do tragedy. It's not so much that people die, houses die. A house does something more than, but including a family. So it's like a family dies, maybe. A house dies. A kind of whole lineage passes. As Varia exclaims, quote, "Yes, life in this house is over. There will be no more of it." I mean, how are we to take that line? Is that like a tremendously tragic line? Or is that a line in which, well, it's just more silliness, Varia being silly? That is a question, unto itself. But getting back to the violence that we see done in this particular scene, we might still find Varia's violence ridiculous, right? When she hits Lopakin with the stick, or when she brandishes the parasol and he flinches at the very end of the play. But the emphasis, if we feel we're reading a tragedy, even a peculiarly Russian tragedy, might fall on how the stick hurts. Because hurt it does, right? Lopakin reports an immense bump coming up, unless that's just nonsense and extravagance and exaggeration on the part of Lopakin, right? Once again, that's the comic, the comedic genre exerting itself when I ask that question. See what I'm saying? We have to recall this is a man who, as a peasant child, was referred to as ignorant, beaten Yermolai. He received emotional bumps much worse than any physical bumps that he might have received, because the emotional bump is so lasting that he flinches. He flinches when any stick is raised, okay, in his vicinity. And I don't know, I kind of, to the extent that that's what you take away from these micro scenes in which pretty insignificant violence is done to the body of Lopakin, are you not allowing the genre of tragedy to compel your attention in those moments? So much depends upon genre. Yes, indeed, much depends on genre. More on 200 Mod 1 Q2. Adriana on Chekhov certainly would agree with this statement, considering the fact that this play is farce completely reframes, for example, the example that she treats at some length here, and I think very cogently, Lopakin's villainous actions. Lopakin's actions will appear villainous, which is to say, the kinds of actions that maybe an agonist in a tragedy would perform, or the kinds of actions that the evil person, the bad person, in a melodrama, where you have clear distinction between bad and good, much clearer than you have in tragedy. The evil actions that would be, bad actions that would be, right, performed by the villain of the melodrama, right? And you could reframe this play as a farce in which those villainous actions seem sort of silly and goofy and ineffectual. And let's get a little bit into some of the details that she mentions. Lopakin, hailing from a line of serfs, has become rich and now financially advises Lyubov and Gaev, Lubov's brother, right? It's going to be Lyubov for some of you. Lopakin, thinking only of remedying the orchard's debt, apparently thinking only of that, says he's delighted to share that he came up with a solution that would mean that the estate would bring in 25,000 rubles of profit every year. And you will recall what happens, right? Gaev and Lyubov think that his plan is silly, really stupid, utterly absurd, that it's rot, as Adriana mentions, right? And, they end up being proven wrong. Lopakin says, picking up right in the middle of the paragraph, Lopakin says that the orchard will be sold by August 22nd. There's not much anybody can do. And despite the silly dismissiveness of Lyubov and Gaev, this very serious consequence, right, comes into being. The orchard is sold, just as Lopakin warned. Now here's the twist. It's revealed at a party afterwards. It's a really joyous party, isn't it? That Lopakin was the one who bought the property. The one who advised them that they needed to sell it is also the one who bought it. So I mean, that seems kind of villainous, doesn't it? He doesn't reveal that before, or as he's offering the advice, right?
His actions are a surprise to everyone. No one considered Lepakin, someone so close to the family, would swipe the estate out from under them and move along with the plans to cut down the cherry trees. And you go back to his serf origins and some of the resentment that he shows in the play. And you can see this as a revenge plot, which is the kind of thing that we have in tragedy, right? Certainly in melodrama, a revenge plot, right, performed by Lepakin to get back at the family that mistreated him when he was young. Well, that's looking at the play as a tragedy or certainly as a melodrama. You could reframe it as a farce, though, and what's amazing about this play is just how easily that is done, right? And in doing so, what you would do, if you successfully did that, we'll get into that in a few moments, right? If you were successful in re-seeing all of these seemingly very serious events as events proper to a farce, just a goofy, silly, nutty kind of comedy, right? You would have some pretty strong evidence of Dubraw's claim of just how strongly shaping our generic expectations, right? Again, from the perspective of tragedy, Varia, that's another character in the play, of course, her supplication suggests an unfair and terrible fate has befallen the characters of the play. Think of Gaev and Lyubov especially. And this is Varia's, right? This is her tragic frame around the action of the play, right? And think about how her words would sound if we heard them spoken by Esmini or Antigone, okay? But here's the point, and this is an illustration of what Dubrau has to say, right? One might point to the equally, potentially at least, tragic moment of Madame Renevsky's emotional response to the auction of the family's beloved estate and see it as completely silly. My estate, my beautiful estate. This is the person who's been giving money away to tramps that she meets out on the street, right? A student in a different section put it this way. Her nostalgia, her inability to let go of the past, and her tears are often portrayed as symbols of the passing of an era and the inevitable change that accompanies it, right? This is a student who wanted to see the tragic frame. However, as yet another student puts it, when approaching the cherry orchard as a farce, we can view Madame Renevsky's, that's Lyubov's reaction, as comical and exaggerated. My estate, my beautiful estate, said by someone who has frittered away all the resources that might have preserved the estate and who, by the way, has lived for years now away from the estate, right? So you can see this as phony, comic, exaggerated. It's the absurd thing in the play, not Lepakin's plan, but her reaction to the success of that plan. Her refusal to accept the reality of the situation, the student goes on. Her melodramatic outbursts and her failure to take practical steps to prevent the auction to begin with can be seen as elements of absurd comedy. As one student puts it, I don't think it's a better word to describe Madame Renevsky than melodramatic, but hers, she's melodramatic not in the way that we have in a lot of melodramas, but in the way that we have in the self-dramatizing excesses of somebody who's the comic idiot in a romantic comedy, for example, or some other sort of comedy, or a farce, especially a farce where you have just about everybody in a farce is self-dramatizing and melodramatic in that sense, right? Her auction room characterization of her state is beautiful. Quote, according to the same student, may appear less as a tragic expression of loss and more as a humorous exaggeration of her attachment to material wealth and status. Okay?
So much depends upon genre, right? So much that, in fact, we may imagine that genres are fixed categories, static categories that don't change, and that the original genre is somehow given to us as though we didn't discover them or construct them ourselves as human beings over the course of whatever civilization, in the history of whatever civilization of which we were a part, that there's these fixed categories that probably transcend civilizations. So you have Chinese tragedies, right? Indian tragedies, you have African tragedies, you have American tragedies, Russian tragedies, right? And tragedy is just this category that just won't change. Well, not precisely, right? Not precisely, although the question is very complex. And we're not going to get to the bottom of some of these questions
that I'm introducing. The important point is to introduce the questions and get you thinking about some of these topics right now, because I think it's going to make you better English majors, right? So turning to what you had to say, as Chris and Carly agree, the Cherry Orchard, whatever it is, certainly is not simply a comedy. As Chris notes, echoing Joanna's term, some of the social topics are a little too dark, especially the scene where suicide is brought up between Yepahatov and Dunyasha. Michael asserts that, quote, this play has elements of both comedy and tragedy. A reader may perceive The Cherry Orchard as a tragic play with comedic undertones or as a comedic play with dark undertones. I thought that was very well said. Carly introduces the notion of a tragic comedy, or later, as she puts it, comic tragedy, which is discussed, tragic comedy, yes, by Abrams and Harfin, and makes me want to ask you, and this could almost be a discussion question, couldn't it? It's not, but it could be. Does it fit their definition? You know, does The Cherry Orchard fit the definition offered by Abrams and Harfin of the tragic comedy? Okay. Does it threaten tragedy but end up, this is one of the criteria, does it threaten tragedy, threaten to become a tragedy, but end up ending happily as the way a comedy would? So that's where we get the tragic comedy, where even tragedy precedes in the term itself the structure of the term comedy, tragic comedy. So you get a sense of the sequence and the way that it works, although you can imagine it working the other way around, which we're going to go back to Carly's notion of the comma tragedy, right? Hey, by the way, is not tragic comedy not so much a threat to the notion of genre, it's just a new genre, one which, introduced, further testifies to the power of genre to structure perceptions, etc., right? So here's somewhere in the middle. Do you see where we are here? Somewhere in the middle between a hymn of praise of the extraordinary formative power of these fixed and static categories as though they were handed to us by some divinity, tragedy, comedy, I guess tragic comedy, but that's my whole point here, is that tragic comedy seems to have arrived on the scene after tragedy and comedy have come into the round. It's a more modern mode, okay? There probably are some tragic comedies. You can make the argument that they're tragic comedies further back in the tradition, but it's not a dominant genre, okay, on par with comedy and tragedy back in the Greek scene, right? The ancients, amongst the ancients, they wrote tragedies and the comedies. They didn't have a category called tragic comedy. When they had their contests, they used to have these contests between these playwrights. They had a contest in tragedy. They did not have a contest in which people entered examples of tragic comedy. That is a more Johnny-come-lately genre, okay? So you can see what it testifies to, does it not? I mean, what I just said, you could say the emergence of tragic comedy as a genre in its own right speaks to the power of genre, right? Because when we get something that falls between two genres, we just come up with a new genre. At the same time, it speaks, does it not, to so it speaks to the staying power of specific genres, right? And the shall we say the power of that very term and concept genre, right? At the same time, it speaks, does it not, to the fact, as I said before, that they really can be mixed, as it were, okay? Although what comes out of the mix between fixed categories that turn out not to be fixed might itself be a genre, if you see what I'm saying. So you kind of get evidence of both possibilities there. The fact that it's not as though genres don't conceivably evolve, that they don't mutate, and that they don't mix and kind of have offspring, as it were. Beautiful children, the beautiful child called tragicomedy, right? It's a child of tragedy and comedy. At the same time, tragicomedy comes into her own right as a powerful new genre that resists change and that seems to last over many, many years, okay? If it's a viable, as it were, aesthetic offspring. Still, don't some works fall outside existing genres? Are genres that immobile, immutable? What about trifles? Wait, trifles is a tragedy, right? Isn't it? Sort of? Well, what the heck is it if it's not a tragedy? Is it some mixed genre? These questions are asked apropos of your responses to one of the discussion questions, 200 MOD1 Q1. If you walk up to a sad play with tragedy in mind, you'll see tragic elements. If our discussion is any indication, and certainly I invited you to walk up to trifles with tragedy in mind. Little wonder that you did, though most of you found it to be tragic with extreme qualifications. Naya, noting the vague quality of the Abrams-Harfman definition, one uncomplimented, at least in the portion that is quoted by Naya by any Aristotelian or Aristotelian inflection, which I'll get to down below. This is that definition: serious actions eventuating a disastrous conclusion for the protagonist, who is the person who performs those actions. Well, Naya finds Glaspell's trifles, according to this definition, a tragedy in every single kind of context. And Maggie agrees, quote, I think Glaspell's trifles is a tragedy in its entirety. But I think both Naya and Maggie end up offering some qualifications, which are captured perhaps, or certainly exemplified in a different form, if not in the same form, by Jocelyn. According to one definition of a tragedy, the content must revolve around the protagonist and have a disastrous conclusion. And here Jocelyn again is quoting from the Abrams-Harfman book. Mrs. Wright was not heavily written into the play, says Jocelyn, but she was the protagonist in Trifles. The murder of Mr. Wright acted as more of a liberation for Mrs. Wright, but her placement in jail could be considered as the disastrous conclusion to her story. Note Jocelyn's sense of some possible qualifications and objections to the claim that she's offering. But the real tragedy throughout the play was seen in the mistreatment of the women and the evident gender inequalities between the male and female characters. Some of the most notable moments that display this were seen in the patronizing way the men laughed at the women's concerns, and when Hale commented about women, that's Mr. Hale, being used to worrying over trifles. Note how the qualifications and even objections start to pop up, even as soon as the claim is established. For one thing, she who would appear to be the overreaching protagonist of the play, as Jocelyn notes, that would appear to be, of course, Mrs. Wright. She would appear to be, Mrs. Wright, the Antigone of the play. Well, she is indeed not, as Jocelyn notes, heavily written into the play. You could argue she does not appear in it at all. She really doesn't. She's not on stage. Noah notes something like this when he says, Mrs. or Mr. Wright are not the main characters or protagonists, and they are the two of the characters in the play with the most tragic events in the story, besides Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale for hiding evidence. Nathan, indeed, says, indeed, the main characters of the story are Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale, not Mr. Wright and Mrs. Wright, Mrs. P and Mrs. Hale, the only protagonists on stage. So that is a pretty severe objection or qualification of the claim that we have a tragedy before us, because we do not have tragic actors in the action of the play. Moreover, note Adriana's question. Quote, for Mrs. Wright, murdering her husband would represent the disastrous conclusion for both herself and her husband. However, she remains unmoved and unbothered by his murderer. This is not an element of tragedy that a lot of attention to is paid in the works that you've been looking at, the works on tragedy, the documents telling you about tragedy. But typically what you have in a tragedy, a Greek tragedy, lots of tragedy, is you have, even post-Greek, you have a scene of suffering. Think of Macbeth at the end of the play, when he's suffering. Hamlet is suffering. You have these scenes of suffering. A great example of that is Creon, after he has discovered that his family is dead. Okay, and we don't really have that, as Adriana has noted. We don't really have that in the play. We don't see Mrs. Wright suffering. Okay, so that leads one to ask, or it leads Adriana to ask, was this indeed a tragedy for Mrs. Wright? And do we even find out how she feels about being in jail? Because you could argue it's the incarceration that's a tragedy as opposed to the murder. Are we sure she'll even stay in jail, though, given what happens at the end of the play, even if we do determine by inference that she is suffering in the jail? Do we have here's what this boils down to, is we wonder whether we have a disastrous conclusion for this protagonist, who, by the way, is only the protagonist before the action of the play, which is to say, off the stage on which the play is produced. Of course, the husband, John Wright, dies disastrously for him, if not for Mrs. Wright, but he's not the protagonist. Isn't he indeed the agonist, the villain, right? The Tybalt to the Mercutio or the Romeo of this play. Jocelyn again, quote, but the real tragedy throughout the play was seen in the mistreatment of the women and the evident gender inequalities between the male and female characters. And you see what Jocelyn is saying here, which is very subtle and very cogent and very persuasive. But notice how objections begin to crop up immediately here too. When we shift our sense of the tragic actors of the play, we have to multiply them here, I guess, to Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. We shift it from the Wrights to the Peters and Hale, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. A new problem crops up, if you see. As John, a student in another section, wonders, quote, I don't believe trifles is a tragedy at all. And it's certainly not a tragedy to the extent that Mrs. Hales and Mrs. Peters suddenly become the so-called tragic actors. It is, in fact, as he argues, more so a social commentary that is centered around a sad and dramatic event, but not an event that rises to the level of tragedy, though he's staying away from that specific question. The point is that event is not on stage. It's not part of the action of the play. The focus of the play is on the subversion of gender roles. John's premise is one that I respect. And his premise is this, that a work cannot be a tragedy and a social commentary at the same time. Now, I want to explain that briefly here by first turning to Maggie, who notes that Aristotle's sense of tragedy, quote, involves incidents arousing pity and fear wherewith to accomplish the catharsis, purging away of such emotions. Maggie notes this sense, which I want to say is Aristotle's sense. It's the Aristotelian sense that tragedy must have at its end these two emotions that rise up in the viewer's emotional arena. Okay? When Harfam and Abrams, Maggie continues, when Harfam and Abrams mention that Aristotle thinks tragedy means incidents arousing pity and fear, it's a perfect example of trifles. And I want to say, well noted, Maggie, it is indeed time to bring Aristotle into the conversation, but doing so may point to a different conclusion. For by fear, Aristotle, who I'm shortening here to Airy, fear for Aristotle points to an awesome sense of human limitation before the gods and fate. And one wonders whether we truly experience such feelings at the end of Glaspell. Maggie resourcefully argues that this story goes into the darkness that women often deal with regarding men. And I think that's so well said. But I'm wondering, is not that darkness remediably moral, social, and even political? It's a political darkness in which these men live. It's a social darkness in which this culture conducts its social arrangements. It's a moral darkness in which the people in this story live, the people in this play live, which points us to early 20th century American or late 19th century, early 20th century American provincial manners and mores, right? Isn't that what we have in the play? Is something that's you can correct, it's remediable, rather than what you have in a Greek play, a Greek tragedy such as Antigone, where you feel that there's something mysterious about what happens, mysteriously and irremediably, almost metaphysical, is what you get this insight into something beyond the human world where a different political arrangement could take care of this problem. Tragedy points, according to Aristotle, to a darkness that cannot be enlightened. It's the inescapable human condition. Does not Glaspell hope to enlighten, hope to change? If so, she believes that women's fate is laid out in trifles, is indeed changeable, it can be corrected. And you can see the conclusion that would follow from this line of thinking. Does that not make her play a bit social and political for tragedy? Does it not make it a work, as this fellow John from another section has said, a work of social criticism? And does it not point us to Noah, who's in our own section, to Noah's insight, Noah's conclusion that in the end, trifles may have elements of what makes a tragedy, but it is not one in itself, which I thought was a nicely nuanced conclusion to come to. And in coming to such a conclusion, don't we feel this certain question is raised, okay? Is not a play like this one a work of social criticism? Is it not a form of writing that is political? Is it not a polemic, as opposed to being a literary form of writing, which needs to avoid the polemic, right? You see the larger question. Can polemical writing be literature? I think that's a very good question. And there's a long tradition of people having doubts about that one way or the other, okay? But this much is true. To answer in the negative and to say that polemical writing cannot be literature is to believe that genres are pretty fixed, pretty immobile. Is it not? And this is the question is that so?
Okay, then, so trifles may be occupies not the space of an existing genre, but seems to point at something, I don't know, perhaps clearing space for some future genre, conceivably, itself a, metaphorically speaking, genetic mutation away from tragedy, which you see even in some of the decisions made by Glaspell, for example, chiefly that of moving tragic action off stage and placing us at a point outside of such action, beyond such action, where much of the significance of that action is still to be determined, right? It's not immediately present. There are all kinds of ways in which, in fact, we don't have what Aristotle seemed to think was required for a tragedy, and that again could be a nice little discussion question, but that's a good example of the kind of discussion question that would be better if this were a course on Renaissance tragedy, as opposed to a course which is all about an introduction to literature, right? So once again, there's certain topics that are just exceedingly interesting, probably to you as well as they are to me, that are not our proper focus because they just require that we go into too much detail in certain directions. It takes us away from the center line of what we're doing in the class, which has to do in this moment with genre, right? So let's offer something of a generalization at this point. Genres are in motion. They're not static. They're not static. They're stable now. You know, they're not wavering all over the place, are they? We don't have these genres mutating wildly in any number of different directions over time, right? But I repeat, they're not static. They are mutable, okay? And I want to introduce a new concept here because it's an idea that we'll be employing. They're also modal, right? Now, what do we mean by that? We're going to get into Fowler here in a moment, not just to explain what one might mean by modal, but to confirm some of the points that we've just made. So let's just begin with Fowler, and I'll come back to this notion of mode here in a moment, which is something that we'll be employing down the road of the course. This is what Fowler has to say. Considering genres as families, by the way, Fowler's writing about himself. Can you imagine that? In this book, so when Fowler shows up, he's talking about himself. Considering genres as families, as Fowler did, Fowler notes, made it possible, even obligatory, to adopt a diachronic historical approach, and so offered a fresh approach to the problem of historical change. For Fowler, the so-called fixed historical kinds are not at all fixed but mutable, continually renewed repertoires of characteristic features, external structure, rhetoric, topics, and the like, right? And I underline that statement because it struck me as important. For Fowler, and perhaps for us, the so-called fixed historical kinds, comedy, tragedy, perhaps tragicomedy, right? And we can get outside of genre thus considered, and talk about lyric, narrative, which is a kind of a different register of genre that we don't need to go into the differences right now, right? But narrative, lyric, and dramatic. And within dramatic, of course, we have comedy and tragedy, right? But for Fowler, the so-called fixed historical kinds, comedy, tragedy, narrative, lyric, all the rest, are not at all fixed. They're immutable. They are continually renewed repertoires of characteristic features, external structure, rhetoric, topics, and the like. For example, rhetoric in Antigone, you have the chorus speaking in a certain way that you don't have Creon speaking, right? And you have Antigone lamenting. You have like the lamentation over the death of the brother, which is a characteristic rhetorical trope that we find in Greek tragedy. External structure has to do with, we could go through some of the details there, but I think maybe you'd be good at naming them yourselves, right? External structure would have to do with the fact that we have a political situation, you know, Creon, you have those in a lot of the Greek tragedies have, it's an affair of state that is at issue, right, in the story, the external structure, the social structure. It's a big cultural or social episode that is at the center of these, right, and that might even be fall more under the issue of topic. External structure might have to do with, like, you know, even the sequence of, you remember Freytag's pyramid, where we have an exposition, and then we have rising action, and we have a climax, which, you know, denouement and all that stuff, right? Falling action and the denouement. What we have in tragedy, of course, is, for example, according to Aristotle,
the recognition, anagnoresis, right, was the Greek term. We also have the scene of suffering, right? So we have all these conventions, you know, aumatia, right, and hubris, the tragic flaw, and the tragic pride, which is at the heart of so many tragedies, right? These are those characteristic features that are continually renewed, and the repertoire is a continually renewed, you know, as tragedy makes its way through the tradition, okay, according to Fowler. And the renewal itself is a sign of mutability, okay, of the fixed historical kind known as the genre, because we do have little changes that you can see, for example, as you just go down the history of like Senecan tragedy, you know, revenge tragedy, all the different tragedies, Roman tragedy, you arrive at Shakespearean tragedy, make your way into more modern tragedy, and you see that it's still recognizable as tragedy, but it's not that there has not been no change, okay, in the kind. Now he goes on to say, such repertoires are not a means of classification so much as a source of signs and a language or coding system that allows economical yet intelligible communication. Quote, change of the repertoires is continual, for new works signify precisely by their modulating of specific previous states of the genre. Hence, their own addition to it modifies the existing state, and a series of such successive changes may alter it almost out of recognition. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with Fowler except to say that to the extent that it gets altered out of recognition, don't we have a different genre at that point? And maybe that's his point, is that, you know, to the extent that it's not out of recognition, even if it comes close to being out of recognition, you can tell there that you still have tragedy, and it still deserves that term with a big T even, right? Which testifies once again to the power, though not, you know, immutable and static, the power of genre, just as a, you know, it exhibits this kind of power, what we call staying power, right? It just lasts. And he has more to say, and I've got some other stuff underlined down below, but I think this this micro lecture is almost becoming a macro lecture at this point. Let me just read the last sentence. Throughout kinds of literature, the last underlined sentence, throughout kinds of literature, that's Fowler's own book. Throughout, I should say, kinds of literature represents, quote, genre as a continually dynamic metamorphosis whereby in the course of history, kinds are assembled, become more consciously practiced, form the basis of modes, enter into temporary mixtures, hybrids, and modulations, and combine to form new kinds. And that's where this idea of the mode comes in to play that I mentioned above. Told you I'd tell you something about. May wait till next time to talk more about this because we're going to be talking about chorus, the chorus for next week. And we're going to be talking about how the chorus moves from a kind of feature of the genre, right, one of those characteristic features, to, I mean, it's still there as a feature, you know, when we get to Chekhov, when we get to perhaps even trifles, we see that we don't have some sort of form of the chorus. That'll be one of your questions, something related to that question. If we do not have, do we not have some sort of form, some sort of, you know, successive change, to quote Fowler? Yes, we'll have signs of successive change in the chorus, but we still have something that's not altered completely out of recognition. It still looks a little bit like a chorus, still sounds a little bit like a chorus. Do we not have that as we move forward? Okay, and as tragedy, you know, shows that indeed it's not immutable because it mutates, right? And you wonder whether that's not this thing that he's calling the mode, right? When you have a particular feature of you know, of a genre that seems to wander into some space outside of the genre where you don't have a recognizable tragedy anymore, but we have what's called the tragic mode showing up in a play that would seem to be of a different genre or of an indeterminate genre. And this is something we'll be talking a little bit about as we go through and go forward. I mean, as you can see, Fowler here thinks that, in fact, new genres sometimes come out of these wandering modes, which are, of course, little pieces, little portions of the repertoire, of the tragic repertoire, right? And little portions of the repertoire, certain elements of the repertoire kind of become mobile and wander out beyond the existing genre into their own space. A drama gets formed around them, so to speak. And before you know it, when enough people find this very compelling, we have a new genre, right? And maybe a couple of different modes wander out of, maybe you could see this even with tragic comedy, that it's like certain portions of tragedy, portions of the repertoire, certain elements of the repertoire of comedy, wander, mix, we get tragic comedy. Okay, well, that's enough for today. Didn't go back to what I promised you last time. Broken promise then? I don't know. I don't know that you can lose a lot of sleep over this, but didn't go back to Matthew Arnold. I was intending to do that, but I just felt that no, just get directly to the business of the day, and we can come back to that on some future occasion. I think you did a very nice job on the whole question of the humanities, so it's a topic that I'm pretty happy with right now. So in any event, keep your eyes open for the new granular modular schedule that will be showing up. As you know, those tend to show up on Friday. And get the reading done. It will have the reading listed. And I will talk to you again next week. And of course, you'll have discussion board questions beginning to show up on Friday. So have a good weekend. Bye-bye.